Bhuvan, what is leadership in school?
So, leadership is a capability that can be developed and nurtured by anyone and everyone. Leadership is a skill, is a set of behavior and attitudes which would help the school and everybody in the school to get together and feel that sense of community. And there'll be leadership is a skill which helps everybody to come together, and there are different styles, but a transformational leader or a change agent would bring about that change and diversity and bring about that inclusion in that school. Leadership, it's not just about one person, but it's about everybody can be a leader, including the learners, the facilitators, and even like all the peers and teachers. Every teacher in the classroom is a leader. So leadership as a process it can be cultivated and nurtured in that manner.
Angeline, would you like to elaborate a bit? Bhuvan already started explaining who are the leaders we are talking about.
Yes, that's right. So I think, Bhuvan mentioned that there are many people we would classify as educational practitioners. And so that includes everyone who has a role or a responsibility where you're going to have influence in a school. So a teacher has a lot of influence in their classroom, even teaching assistants, coordinators and heads of department really help shape and support teachers. So they have a lot of power and influence as well. There are also principals and heads of schools, obviously, who are very influential in their spaces. And so when we're thinking about everyone being a leader, we're thinking about the power that everyone has to influence the people within their spheres. So that includes also students as leaders, right? So and our main role as leaders is to support students have what they need. So we need to center them and think about what their needs are and involve them in decisions that affect them. And so when we're saying that all students are leaders, we also need to keep in mind that we're not doing this in a really performative way, and that students can contribute to decision making and they need to develop their skills so they can do this effectively and we also need to address this misconception that when we say students are leaders, that this means that students have like executive decision making around the school and that we, lean into everything that they decide needs to happen, because I'm sure everyone would like to have a separate different lunch menu and more play recess time. However, that's not going to be the case, but they need to contribute into decisions that affect them.
Thank you. And we can be leaders in many different ways. So Emma, what are guiding principles that underpin an inclusive leadership?
Thank you. So guiding principles are really key to inclusive leadership because they remind us that leadership is not just about implementing policy, but also about living inclusion. And that's part of the reason why in this chapter we've emphasized that everybody needs to see themselves as a leader. So in the chapter we've defined some guiding principles, but it's really important to emphasize that these principles should be reviewed and adjusted in the context that they're being implemented in. So some of these guiding principles, we've split them into three key areas: characteristics, beliefs and values, and leadership styles. In terms of characteristics, it's really important that leaders are caring, that they are ethical, that they are self-aware. So they're always reflecting on the values and beliefs that they're bringing to their role, and also biases and how these might impact on others. And this applies across the various leadership roles. The other thing that I think is really important for leadership in inclusion is a capability to tune into other people. So not just to kind of be self-aware, but to really tune into how other people are feeling, what their experiences are, and how they're kind of responding to what's happening to them in the environment. And then in terms of beliefs and values, we all bring our own sets of beliefs and values to the contexts where we that we operate in. But we think that it's important to cultivate specific beliefs and values for leadership for inclusion, and these include valuing dignity. So in the chapter, we've really emphasized the importance of thinking of inclusion and associating it with equity. So where children need specific allowances or resources to allow them to have equal access to education, then we need to put those in place. So respecting dignity, valuing diversity, of course. And then in terms of leadership styles, there are many leadership styles that the literature talks about. We haven't in the chapter defined a preferred leadership style because we think it should be a process that's decided by the leader and also in the context. But we have suggested some possible leadership styles, including distributed leadership, which means that you're sharing leadership with people in your context. Ethical leadership, so making sure that any kind of actions that you take are in the best interests of other people. And also socially responsible leadership, which is in a similar way highlight the importance of acting in ways that are really self-aware and in the best interests of other people.
So after these definitions of leadership, let's move to how inclusive leaders can nurture pathways for inclusion. And the first aspect we are going to address is the one related to a shared understanding of inclusion. So Bhuvan, what exactly do we need to have a shared understanding of?
So basically, the concept of inclusion is constantly evolving, and it is a concept that it is changing and evolving, and in the sense that looking at outside environment and our external factors, we need to understand and adapt the process. And it is a process where the entire inclusion would not have been there if there weren't any traditional models of segregation and the segregation never existed. But now that it did exist, unfortunately, it did exist, and now we do have inclusion and that concept. So that concept with constantly evolving, we understand how the community and the sense-making process is going forward with that. And in order to understand this concept, we are expanding that notion of inclusion and trying to incorporate the different communities, different stakeholders into this process, and making a shared understanding that it's around the people and the communities.
Thank you. And if we speak of leadership for inclusion, then we speak very much also about change. So how can leaders manage and accelerate change?
Yeah, I think change processes for any leader to facilitate is really complicated and complex. And as Bhuvan mentioned, if we want to make sure that many different people are involved, then they need to have opportunities to have a say in decision making. And so the distributive, transformative leadership and a non-hierarchical structure we've talked about really helps that process, because if people understand the reasons for decisions, then they're going to accept the legitimacy of them, and they're going to have more ownership and be on board. And also, if they are involved in the process of decision making, then immediately it's transparent, for them how decisions came about. And also the role that they play in that decision making gives them sort of an opportunity to really contribute and participate into how to make that change happen in the school. And this should involve, as many community members as is needed, so that you have more of a shared understanding that is really important. And also, I think the biggest decision that schools make for this, there are probably two great things that are very common. So one is, you need obviously a clear strategic mission and direction and your purpose, so that your mission and vision and values is shared. And in order to operationalize that, that's where your policies come in. Mm-hmm. And the policies, making work is probably the least attractive work in a school for people to have, but it's really, really crucial, because we need to have clarity before accountability. And so how one's mission is going to be operationalized through the school policies, when we're clear on this, then we can promote change in a more accelerated way. The policies really have the power to shape culture and also to sustain inclusive organizations, after perhaps leadership changes in a school or your staff changes, and so that's policies there as a point of reference to hold your community accountable for what it's set out that it wants to do.
Thank you, Angeline, for leading us already into the topic of policies. So, Emma, what would you say what makes a policy inclusive?
Okay, thanks. So I think it's very easy to talk about making a policy inclusive, but I think, as Angeline was just saying, it's a difficult thing to achieve, but it's key it's a key aspect of leadership for inclusion. And as Angeline was just saying, policies drive inclusion. So it's essential that the policy reflects what we see as very important in terms of inclusive practice, and that they clearly articulate all the components of inclusion that we really value. In the chapter, we highlight two key areas of inclusive policy making. One is student-centred policy making, and the other is the importance of all constituent members of the school seeing themselves reflected in and also contributing to the policy making process. And again, we think it's really important to acknowledge that this is not an easy process to undertake, and it is very much a process. So we should be seeing the development and review of policies as something that is ongoing, reflexive, and involves all constituent members. A very important aspect of successful implementation of policy is that the people who are responsible for enacting it, which essentially involves all members of the school community, are aware of why it matters. So it's not just presented to them as a kind of foregone conclusion. They have been involved in the development of it, or at least been allowed to review it and have a voice in terms of its final version. So they see themselves in the policy, they understand why it matters, and they understand how they can contribute to implementing it. And unless we take this kind of inclusive participatory approach, it's likely that just a small number of people in the school will kind of connect to policy, and then the implementation process won't be as kind of comprehensive as it needs to be.
Yeah, I think we certainly want policies to come alive and not just to sit on a shelf collecting dust. And I think there's a real interconnectedness between the policies. So when we're thinking about leadership for inclusion, we're actually want the philosophies and values to underpin all the policies. You might have a gender policy around that, but how perhaps we serve transgender students when they go away on trips, for example, might also show up in your safeguarding policy. And so they're very interconnected, and inclusive values need to underpin all of them. And so I think also one of the important things that we need to address in our policies are sort of the external parameters that may be exclusionary that happen. So to give you an example, like one might be a legal parameter. Mm-hmm. So for example, according to Equaldex, the world's most LGBT-friendly countries, country like Germany ranks 8th in that with a legal score, their legal score is actually 95 out of 100, which ranks the same as Finland, which ranks first. However, when it comes to public opinion, the score drops down to 62. And so another parameter we have to consider is the cultural parameter. And so how does your policy respond to both the legal and the cultural parameter so that your policy is going to be accessible to the people you're serving and that they can see themselves within it, and so they're going to also implement it as well, because we want policies to be accessible, realistic, and that the implementation can be seen in the community and monitored.
We've already heard we don't want policies to stay on a shelf. So, Bhuvan, how can we then move from policy to practices?
Yes, so building on to what Angelina has said here, it is very important to move and implement it on a day-to-day regular basis. And in order to move forward in this process, we can take data and analyze it and understand as to where the loophole exists and why is the policy not getting implemented. So there is a policy, but in the real world, in a real life context, in a school scenario, does the school parameters allow that policy to be implemented? And we collect data, which could be via school evaluation processes, audits, understanding as to why it is not being implemented on a day-to-day regular basis. And when we understand those inhibitors to the policy implementation, we can work together with different stakeholders as a team to implement it and understand. And at the same time, it's also around follow-up. So it's not just that there was a policy and now it's being implemented, but it could be that because as the external environment is constantly changing, we need to update the policies on a regular time-to-time basis and framework and understand the impact of both the internal and the external factors on it and implement the new revised version. And at the same time, when we talk about this policy and when we bring about this change or updation or modification in the policy, it is very, very important that all the people are involved in the process. All the stakeholders who will be impacted by this change are actually a part of the process. So calling a meeting, communicating it, organizing even a workshop or a seminar where you're able to communicate it to everybody that this is what is going to happen and this is how we are going to update and modify and bring about the change. So it's very important to communicate it as well and being very fair and transparent about this entire process.
Then let's move to our third pathway to inclusion. And the question would be, how do we nurture safe places for diverse identities to grow? I think Emma is starting.
Thanks, Hadrian. So of course, nurturing diverse identity sits right at the heart of leadership for inclusion. And the word nurturing is key, is absolutely key. We use it intentionally to highlight the importance not only of including, but also of supporting, enabling, and really valuing human diversity as something that creates a thriving, successful school community. So that word nurturing, I think, is absolutely key. In the chapter, we've talked about different ways that we can nurture diverse identities. One of these is, of course, through inclusive curriculum. So ensuring that learning and teaching on an everyday basis involves implementation of the curriculum that includes diverse identities. Also removing barriers to learning. And again, it's important to really think of this in terms of an equitable approach. So where children are experiencing unique barriers, they may be related to language, they may be related to psychological needs, they may be related to resources, a lack of resources. In terms of nurturing those identities, we have to ensure that we're responding to individual needs. And then two other areas which we mentioned in the chapter are open and shared decision-making and cultivating a sense of belonging and shared responsibility. So essentially, seeing diverse identities not as something that we need to kind of be addressing, but as something that is really sits at the heart of a successful, caring and thriving school community, and working in ways that we're ensuring all children have equal access to happy, productive learning in a caring environment by taking that equitable approach.
And I also, building on to what Emma is saying here, building on to that, the culture of self-care for leaders is also very important. So we have trained the trainer session or a session where the leaders are able to engage in genuine self-care. So it could be about their physical and mental well-being, adequate sleep. They are able to get good sleep, a balanced, nutritious diet, and at the same time, they're able to understand the importance of their own mental well-being and health. And it's also about having a culture of professional and a culture of inquiry. So say, for example, if I am a new teacher in any school and there is a senior teacher, I should not be apprehensive to approach him or her. So it's about, I have a lot of doubts in my head as to how this thing operate or what is the surrounding or the environment like. So I am able to openly discuss this with my senior colleagues and with my peers, of course. And then it's also about a culture of, by a culture of inquiry, I mean that I have a lot of creative inputs and I would like to say it to my leaders and to my line managers. And I'm not afraid of saying it out loud that, I know you have been doing this in an X, Y, and Z manner, but why not we modify this and try it another way? So that's a culture of reflection and a culture of inquiry, whereby we are constantly engaging in an open dialogue, and we are taking each other's feedbacks and opinion. And also with respect to having well-being at the core of every decision-making process. So whichever policy that is there in place and we are trying to implement it on a day-to-day basis, but we understand the importance of having well-being at the core and at the center of these policies and implementing it on a day-to-day basis. And it's underpinning every decision-making inside the school, and the decision would definitely have an impact on the communities and the societies.
Yeah, I think definitely the health and well-being is extremely important, and you mentioned the mental health and well-being too. And I think when we hire for inclusion, we need to be looking for people with these skills, and who are able to then have the mindsets and skill sets in order to move this forward. And hopefully with a lot of this new teacher training that's happening, that we are developing those skills from the outset, and that we're able to see more of that being represented in teachers to come and also in leaders to come. And our teaching profession, we have not always reflected the student population in terms of their demographic. And so I think we really need to make another preventative measure is to make intentional steps to diversify our human resources pool. So it's thinking about how we can be inclusive in our hiring processes and what you can do in the school to retain teachers who have intersectional identities that may not be represented in their colleagues. And also how we are allocating resources to support teams and to be successful. And an allocation of resource is, for example, professional learning and access to that. And so leaders need training, so that they have the inclusive mindsets that we need to be successful. They also need training in supporting how they facilitate having hard conversations, because this is really a thing that leaders struggle with. Like, so if you were brought up in a household where we don't talk about race or sexuality, then you're not going to have that comfort to discuss topics that may become controversial in your community, and to be able to navigate differences and to bridge across them so that your students are safe in that space. You also need to be able to manage, not only be a change management professional, but you're actually contributing to social change. And this is going to be different than, say, if you're bringing in a new initiative that is, for example, if it's educational technologies that you're bringing in. This is something where you have to manage hardware and software and teacher training around how to implement that. But we're talking about social change and acceptance of things that have traditionally been marginalized. And so it's really touching on changing the whole faculty's identity, consciousness, as well as educators, what this means for them as a professional, how they're going to show up at school and in the classroom. And so they need to be aware too that these precious learners under our care, it's their formative years. And so we're supporting their identity development. So do you have the skill set to be culturally responsive and sustaining in your pedagogy? And do you have a humanizing approach so that all identities under your care feel safe to be able to thrive in their learning?
The final question we have regards the way leaders can support inclusive partnerships. And this is also the fourth pathway for inclusion we were thinking of. I think Emma has a story about it.
I do have an example. So I've done quite a bit of work with parents from diverse cultural backgrounds who have children with disabilities, talking to them about their experiences of accessing therapy, getting diagnoses. And for those parents, it can be a very overwhelming process because they are trying to connect with a huge range of different agencies in the community, in the health sector, in various different sectors. Many of them see schools as the safest place that or the most accessible place for them to get support. So one way that schools can take a leadership role in easing the path or the lives of these parents is to connect themselves with the various sectors that are involved in supporting children with disabilities so that they can help parents to navigate systems and to understand really what the different therapeutic approaches are, how they're supporting their children. And, children spend most of their time at school. Even when they're kind of accessing different therapies, the most of their lives are spent at school. And again, parents see that the schools as a kind of accessible place for them. So schools can take a leadership role in connecting with various different agencies and community entities and supporting parents in that.
And building on to Emma's story, I completely agree with what she's saying. And for example, if I have students in my class who are from a lower socioeconomic strata and they are not able to get their clothes cleaned on a regular basis, and that makes them awkward to come to school the next day, that, I don't have a clean sweater or I don't have clean clothes to wear to school, so I will not go tomorrow. So having and providing the laundry services to them in the school, and there are some examples of school in the UK that already is into this, but adapting it on a more global scale and providing them different services, which also includes the midday meal programs which are there. But it's also about the quality of those services as well, and that it is accessible to all the students and specifically to those who are not able to access that services in their homes because of belonging to a lower socioeconomic strata. And it's also about giving every student a level playing field and a barrier-free environment where they can holistically grow and develop and learn from each other and from their leaders.
Yeah, I agree with you. What great examples. I really value how one can, and schools are these such valuable communities where we can identify how we can best serve all the students under our care. And when we can't, we need those external agencies to do that. And I think for, educational practitioners and colleagues in our school communities, not everyone has seen themselves reflected in that. So, for example, I am a Chinese Australian. I obviously have an Asian background. I have never worked for a leader who looks like me. And how do I then find community and belonging in spaces that don't reflect who I am? And so what's really helped me in the last few years was looking at an external group such as the Association of International Educators and Leaders of Color, where I've had people who have similar challenges or similar needs, where we're navigating spaces where we don't always feel like we belong, but we can share with each other our strategies and we can grow together. And another example of this is, I saw a need where globally our teaching profession is 70% women, but when it comes to senior leadership positions, the statistics sadly are the other way around. And so what's going on here? How can we mitigate this gap have support people who are aspiring or existing leaders who identify as women? And so a community like the one I co-founded called Women Ed Germany, and there's lots of different women ed groups around the globe. We are there to help people navigate those spaces and support very specific things. And so sometimes when your communities may not have that yet, we may be looking externally for that resource so that we can find what everyone needs in order to be able to thrive and to learn.